Okay, welcome everyone to this Friday's seminar. While people are still settling in, I'll just mention some of the remaining events for this term. It's only a few weeks to the end of term, but we've still got a plethora of events coming up. Firstly, next Wednesday at 3 o'clock, we have a COP16 debrief where members of this department and others of the university who are at the Biodiversity COP in Colombia give a little debrief and reflections. I believe it's in the East Lab. I don't know if it's in here, Matt. It's in the lecture theatre. So it'll be here next Wednesday at 3 p.m. So that's open to anyone who wants to just find out and discuss and understand what happened at the biodiversity meeting in Colombia. And then on Friday, instead of a seminar, we have a panel discussion by a range of social scientists, both from Oxford and from outside, on understanding human-nature relations. How can we foster more collaborative and integrated solutions for tackling the climate and biodiversity issues? So a social science perspective on how we can foster these human-nature relations. The following Friday, we have John Payne talking about the inevitable loss of large mammals in Malaysia, the lessons not learned, and pointers for the recovery of the surviving species. And then on the final Friday of term, we have a double barrel at lunchtime at 1 o'clock. We have Joe Roman, who's talking about Eat, Poop and Die, how animals make our world. And he's the discoverer of the whale carbon pump and the tsunamis and that phenomenon, how whales affect global biogeochemistry. So we'll be talking about how animals more generally shape planetary function. That's at lunchtime at 1 o'clock in the lecture theatre. And then our regular seminar slot at 4:15 is Charles Foster, who's an Oxford academic, talking about the screaming sky, the strange allure of swifts. And this is based on a book he's written about his fascination with swifts and tracing them from Oxford to Mozambique and their journey and the story of their swifts. So that's a fascinating talk as well. So do come along to any of them. They're also always live streamed and also available on YouTube afterwards as well. So now to go on to today's talk, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Nicola Ranger, who's Director of the Global Finance and Economy Group here in the Environmental Change Institute and of the Resilient Planet Finance Lab. And she's also Executive Director of the Oxford Martin Systemic Resilience Initiative, co-director of the UKRI Integrating Finance and Biodiversity Programme, and a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking of the Oxford Martin School. And as you'll hear, her work addresses the advancements of finance and policy, particularly thinking about societal challenges like climate, nature, food, and water. And has a range of roles both in public institutions and in the private sector, and is a key part of the work that we're also doing within the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery in looking at how we can bring appropriate finance and rethink finance in the context of a nature focused world, and which is the subject of our talk today. But thank you.
Well, it's good to see you all. Let me just fiddle around with these buttons that Stephen has told me I have to play with. Okay. So it's lovely to be here. So I'm going to be talking tonight about how we should be reimagining Bretton Woods, and I will explain what Bretton Woods is for those of you that may not know, for nature. So for those of you that sort of might work on the nature finance agenda, so this is going to be a slightly different talk to what I usually speak about. So usually if you hear me speak about this topic, I'll talk a lot about big banks and insurance companies and big asset owners and the nature risks that they face. And I'll also be talking about emerging markets and how we can mobilize nature finance for emerging markets. This is a very, very different perspective. So this is sort of looking at what sort of the global structures that we have that manage our financial system and how we can bring nature into those. And it sort of combines the research that I do here, but also my work previously as a practitioner in government in the UK and at the World Bank, to sort of try and provide this vision. And actually this talk came out of a discussion in the pub, as the best talks often do, with Kate, Ralph, and also Yavinda about 4 months ago when I was, after a few beers, I think, talking about the role of the World Bank in solving the nature crisis. And Yavinda said, right, you need to give a talk on this. So, so I've been held to account. So that was the genesis of this talk. So, okay, so what I'm going to focus on then, so I'm going to sort of start by going back to 1944 and the Bretton Woods Conference. Does anyone know what the Bretton Woods Conference was in 1944? Juan knows. Go ahead, Juan. What? Okay, so the Bretton Woods Conference happened just at the end of World War II. And it was a conference that brought together global leaders to try to define a sort of a new financial system for the world, monetary system for the world, to deal with a lot of the economic problems that had happened in the run-up to World War II that were considered to be a contributing factor to the instability that resulted in war at the time. So it was recognized that if we were going to get out of this cycle of wars from World War I to World War II, so a lot of things needed to happen, but as part of that, we needed a different economic order. And that economic order that was formed in 1944 has evolved a lot since then, but actually some of the key principles that were decided back then are still in operation today. And the two key institutions that came out of it, anyone know what the two key institutions that came out of it were? Exactly, yes. The IMF and the World Bank are still very active in this area. And this gentleman here, we must know who this gentleman here is. This John Maynard Keynes was one of the key designers. So it was basically him and on the US side, Harry Dexter White. There were the sort of the two key architects that actually from the beginning of World War II had come up with this plan and sort of were engaging with countries throughout the war. So I'm going to be talking about why was something that happened back in 1944 relevant today, and why is it important for the future and how we think about nature and climate change and all of these other issues, and how importantly can it help us to get all of our private finance more supportive of our nature goals. So I'm going to sort of split this into 4 parts. The first part is the sort of the historical and present on what is Bretton Woods, why is it relevant today. Then I'm going to talk more about this sort of macro criticality of nature. So this is the kind of research that we do here, looking at the economic consequences of nature loss. I'll talk a bit about the links between nature, climate, and development, and then finally this IFI manifesto for nature at the end. And I'll sort of pause as we go along so we can have some discussion. So the main arguments that I'll make is, so firstly is, see the development and poverty alleviation, which were the core at the mandate, particularly of the World Bank, are dependent on a resilient environment. And that means resilient natural capital. And at the moment, we are eroding that at quite a shocking rate. So nature is providing this absolutely essential global public good at the moment, the loss of which could lead to very, very serious systemic economic and financial risk. And people that I've kindly sort of shared this with for feedback have said systemic isn't a big enough word. This is existential risk. But I use the word systemic because it means things in financial regulation which are important to the argument. So it's critical for our systemic resilience as a society, critical for tackling the threat of climate change, for security and instability, for our well-being, and also obviously for nature's own sake. So this is a really core of the argument, and I'll talk about why I make the argument in this particular way, because it's relevant to finance. But I'll also argue, and I don't think this is new, that our current economic and financial system is part of the problem, a really big part of the problem. So the way that we value or don't value natural capital in decisions, we don't put any value on the externalities that our businesses and financial institutions put onto nature currently. We don't value these systemic risks at all. We don't value the global public goods provided by nature. All of these are distortions in the economic system that push us to what we see now, which is in massive extinction around the world and massive erosion of ecosystem services. So, and you can see this in all of our policies, our laws, our regulations. This critical value of nature is not in there, and it means that it influences how we're making decisions and how we allocate finance to these problems. So I had a few kind of priors and caveats as well. So so this is so that people don't shout at me too much for what I've said. So the priors being, so recognizing that there are different ways of looking at nature. So, nature for nature's sake, nature as culture, nature for society. So this is the Nature Futures framework that is sort of widely agreed and adopted. Now, I am going to be looking in this talk very much through a nature for society lens. But please do not think that doesn't mean that the other two lenses are also extremely important. But I'm looking through that lens. And when we come back to the end, we might think about, and the discussion, well, if you're actually looking through those other lenses, how might all this be different? And would you need a much more radical solution to this problem? The picture in the middle shows that, so I am a former employee of the World Bank, and I am, in general, a person who's very supportive of the role of multilateral institutions. I think they have to play a really important role. So I'm not a person that says we need to throw everything out and start again. No, more through experience of working in these institutions and being sort of in government and thinking about how we solve these problems. It's extremely hard to set up new institutions. So it's often much easier just to look at how you can fix the existing ones. So it is quite a conservative view. And again, other views are welcome when we get to the discussion. We may all agree that we need to totally throw out these institutions and start again, but let's have a discussion at the end about that. The other thing that to mention, so I will be talking a lot about financial institutions and the role of finance, and financial institutions work in particular ways. And I think I love this cartoon because I think this sort of says it all about the incentives on financial institutions and why we're in the trouble that we're in. So financial institutions have no incentive on them to care about the long term. So they will literally do this. They will keep investing in things that are really bad and will destroy our environment until the environment is gone, if not regulated in some way. That's the way that the system is currently set up. So for those who might see, like, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for our shareholders. And so that's part of the problem, and I'll talk a bit about that. The other caveats I'll give is I'm taking quite a purposefully traditional perspective. So I'm sure a lot of economists will say, no, this is radical, but it's purposely staying quite well within the sort of key arguments that financial institutions make. And I'll be using a lot of the language that fits with financial regulation. And that's because often if you make these arguments in a way that fits with current regulatory frameworks, again, it's much easier to make progress rather than saying we need to throw everything out. So I will be talking in terms which might feel quite conservative actually to this, but again, we can talk about that at the end. But I'm doing that on purpose because if you rock up to the IMF and say we need to change everything, it's often quite difficult. Whereas if you say actually there's here, you need to make a tweak here, it can be much more effective. I'm also not going to address all of the wider political economy issues, the very political issues around nature finance, but I want to note those. So there's some really complicated issues around the rights of nature, the role of indigenous groups, how all of this relates to issues of power, the politics of aid. We saw recently at the Commonwealth Summit, the issue of reparations come up again. I'm not going to talk about any of that sort of thing. I'm going to take quite a narrow view of something that hopefully economists, even economists, would agree with. And also, and this is actually something that some colleagues that work in this area have in multilaterals have asked me to make, recognizing that, look, all finance for sustainable development is massively insufficient and needs to be scaled up hugely. So, I'm going to be talking specifically about nature, but we need to see that in a context of a world which is just really not doing enough to support emerging and developing economies at the moment to develop. Okay, so the things I'm going to try and convince you of then is that to resolve these systemic challenges of environmental degradation and biodiversity loss, we need to really place nature at the heart of our global finance and governance. So it's at the moment it's not even mentioned in there. Back in 1944, there was no mention of nature whatsoever. I would argue as well that the World Bank and the IMF, these two Bretton Woods institutions, have a really vital role to play. And the reason I say that is because they're the only global financial institutions that have an explicit mandate to look globally at issues around risk, stability, and long term. And that's important. So the World Bank is, and other development banks are the only institutions that actually have a mandate to think long term. No other financial institution thinks long term. Even central banks don't have to think long term in their mandates. And that's really important, obviously, when you're thinking about risks related to nature. So they have to play an important role. They come with with financial firepower, not a huge amount, but I'll talk about that, but enough. And they have a huge amount of convening power. So an interesting about the World Bank and the IMF versus, say, NGOs or others is they're plugged right into the heart of government. And they're designed to be that way, so that when a policy is made, it's plugged straight in to how governments are thinking through the way that they're lending to governments and supporting them over decades. So they have a huge influence on governments around the world. So we need to make sure that that's a positive influence for nature, obviously. So I say, so they need to think more about this. They need to integrate nature across their operations, advice, and policies. I would argue they're really not right now. They are doing some things, but not anywhere near enough. We need a much larger and more strategic allocation of concessional finance. What concessional finance means is basically cheap finance. So that's one of the things that the multilateral development banks do. If you go to a normal private financial market, you'll pay a certain interest rate. The multilateral development banks offer a much lower interest rate, so it's much more accessible to developing countries. And what they do is they can change if they want to incentivize someone to do something, they can give them an even cheaper interest rate, and obviously then they're incentivized to do it, and that's one of the ways they influence what's happening. And they can play a really important role, many important roles as a norm setter, market builder, knowledge bank, setting the rule book. One of the bigger proposals that I make is that we need what I've called a nature stability board, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But we need some entity which is thinking about this and is monitoring what's happening and has some levers that it can pull outside of our existing institutions. And I'll sort of propose what that might look like. Great. I guess my last caveat is these two quotes. So every time something happens in the world, in the economy, everyone says we need a new Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods is failing, we need a new Bretton Woods. And there was a great book that I used a lot in writing this presentation called The Summit by Ed Conway. And he says the easiest words in economics to say are we need a new Bretton Woods. So I want to give that caveat as well. But I think in this case, we really do need a new Bretton Woods. And hopefully I'll convince you of that. And there was this great quote from Bill Clinton that I came across as well, saying, how come Blair got to call for a new Bretton Woods when you wouldn't let me, to his advisors, which was after the Asian financial crisis. If you remember this at the end, I can tell you what his advisors said back to him as the reason why they didn't, which was quite funny. Anyway, so let's make a start then. So we'll start with the kind of very, very brief history, literally history on one slide. So back at Bretton Woods then, so this was a conference. So I invite you to read about this because it's actually quite funny, because it's always pitched as this huge conference, very lush, this big hotel. If you go there these days, it's a massive hotel in this beautiful setting. But it was actually at the end of the war, it was almost completely derelict. So they had to, after they selected going there, and no one wanted to go there because it was cold, it was hours outside of anywhere. But they decided to go there, and they had to actually send in the army for 2 weeks beforehand to paint the whole building because it was literally just derelict. So this was one of the backstories. But then, so delegations from around the world, so 44 different countries turned up at the conference. So included everyone, obviously the European countries, aside from Germany, who were not invited at the time. Russia was there, China was there, Latin American countries were there. So it was very not fully international, but it was for the time, given that they're in a war, as international as they could. And they all got together for about 3 weeks and tried to come up with this system to correct these big macroeconomic problems that they were having as a world. So, the things that were running up to the war, so the Great Depression in the US that you would have heard of, there were massive sort of currency problems around the world, so currencies fluctuating, runs on banks, and a lot of this was in ways related to how trade flows were operating across the world, and the fact that was basically all over the place, and the gold standard was starting to fail, and there was lots of things happening that contributed to this. So they all got together to try to come up with a new system that would manage that. And a lot of the discussions were about issues of currency, so how currency flows between countries, which I'm not going to talk so much about now because it's not quite as relevant. But they also then devised these two institutions out of it. So the other thing that came out of this as well was going back to the gold standard, and actually the implementation of kind of by the back door of the dollar as the standard for the world, the standard currency. So this was really the first time that happened after this conference, but I won't talk about that. What I think what's really interesting about this conference, which I think is quite different to the discussions today, is that the reason they did this, so they realized that peace, well-being, and prosperity are public goods in their own right. Like, the world cannot survive without these, and that the world needed to work together to create these things and needed to put in systems to enable that to happen. So it's almost like economic and financial stability is a global public good. This was really one of the founding principles, and they put up a lot of money to found these institutions to enable it to provide this stability. Even when we were at the end of World War II, and there was a lot of obviously huge fiscal issues around the world, but it came out of things like the Great Depression, the wars, the devastation, and this feeling like we never want to go there again. So we're going to try and put in place some systems that at least fix the finance part of this. So the two big institutions that came out of it were the IMF and the World Bank, which at that time called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It's still called that, but it's a sub-part of the World Bank now. So there, and actually a lot of the discussion was about the IMF, which I will talk about, but I'll talk more about the World Bank. And the World Bank was kind of an afterthought. It was the idea of John Maynard Keynes, because what he saw after the end of World War I was, because the countries really struggled to recover after World War I, because they had no financing. They'd spent all of their money on responding to the war. They couldn't rebuild, and that had a massive impact. And so they felt they needed an institution, a World Bank, that would provide cheap lending to countries to enable them to recover from World War II. So that was the genesis of it, and it was originally meant to help recover Europe, but in the end it didn't, because the Marshall Plan happened at the same time. So it always more worked with other parts of the world. Yeah. So the two institutions came out of it then. Yeah. So the IMF was much more short term. So the IMF was there to basically provide a fund to support macroeconomic stability. So basically, if a country has a currency crisis, it can go to the IMF and ask for very quick money, and it also has a sort of supervision role. Whereas the World Bank is long-term lending to support development and poverty alleviation, and they both also provide a lot of technical assistance. But they evolved a lot over time. I won't go into all of the details, but just to know, so where they were at the start isn't really what they are today. So particularly the World Bank now. Initially, it was very much set up, as I said, to rebuild Europe, but it very quickly moved into being a builder of infrastructure around the world, and then to have a strong focus on policy, the structural adjustment period, not a good period in its history, and then more recently a sort of sustainable development and global partnerships organization. But what happened at the same time then? So what happened after World War II, obviously, is that we had this very rapid period of growth around the world in historical sense. These are a little bit too small to see, but we had lots of positive things happen. So we had rates of extreme poverty went down, life expectancy went up significantly, things like child mortality went down significantly, literacy went up significantly. So a lot of the story was that the economy, this much more stable economy, was helping and enabling us to grow as a society. But lots of other things came out as a consequence of that stability and growth. So very rapid increases in fossil fuel consumption being one of them. Rapid reductions in forests around the world, big deforestation, biodiversity impacts, plastic production going up significantly. So all of these negative things that were happening at the same time. And you all know these sorts of things, but where we are now is a massive biodiversity crisis, massive declines in our ecosystem services around the world, which really has resulted from this huge growth. So really we've sort of seen growth at the expense of nature for the past couple of decades. And I'd say that the financial system has been a big part of the problem. For a long time, unknowingly so. So, if you look at the finance flows that are estimated to be damaging nature around the world, it's about 7 trillion a year. A lot of people say that's an underestimate. So 7 trillion is damaging nature versus at the moment only about 200 billion being invested in restoring and protecting nature around the world. And the needs are of just over 500 billion. So, the balance is totally wrong at the moment. And that 7 trillion is going into things like intensive agriculture that's leading to deforestation, companies that are leading to pollution, et cetera, et cetera. And part of it is public and part of it is private. So around 1.5 trillion of that is public subsidies for things like intensive agriculture. And really, we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot at the moment. So the types of sectors that are having the biggest impact are things like our food system, materials, energy, capital goods, all of these sectors that are creating economic output, but also doing that through destroying natural capital. And actually, it's only the top 250 companies that are leading to about 73% of the footprint has been estimated. So these are really big companies that are creating the problems. So what's going wrong then? So I would say that the problems that are driving, there's so many problems that are driving all of this, but on the economic side, there's a lot of distortions that are just baked into our economic system at the moment. And so when I was researching this talk, I was trying to look up, was John Maynard Keynes an environmentalist or not? Because see, he died a few decades ago now, before the environmental movement really took off. And he's not seen as an environmentalist at all. But actually, if you read some of his writings, he does recognize the flaw in the systems that he was helping to create. So, for example, he has this beautiful one here: when the rule of self-destructive financial calculation governs every walk of life, we destroy the beauty of the countryside because of the unappropriated splendors of nature have no economic value. So it's that lack of any value within our economic system. And see, there's problems with putting values on things, but and I love this one as well. We are capable of shutting off the sun and the stars because they pay no dividend. They pay a dividend. So even John Maynard Keynes got it in 1930, and then obviously more recently we had Professor Sir Dasgupta, particularly talking about the problems with. We talked about many problems, but the sort of models that we're using to make decisions, and I'll talk more about that in a little while. These models were set up in the 1970s, and they were sort of set up to deal with the problems in the 1970s and didn't capture nature, the value of nature. And those same models are still used in financial and economic decision making today. So, you know, our whole system is making decisions on decision tools that don't include nature at all, don't include that value. Christine Lagarde, you're talking about the role of subsidies. So we're sort of at the moment the environmental subsidies are enormous, damaging subsidies, and so basically we are taxed in order to provide subsidies which then damage us. And then, you know, recently as well, Mark Carney, this is a statement about climate change, but I think equally relevant to nature. When climate change becomes a defining issue for financial stability, it will already be too late. So what he's saying there is that financial markets operate on, at most, 5 years. Most decisions are made on minutes to hours these days. And so they're just not taking into account the impact that they're having on nature at all. So are IFIs part of the problem, this massive growth? How did they cause the problem? So if you look at sort of how their financing of fossil fuels has changed over time, they were financing a lot of fossil fuels. They've come down quite significantly. So the share of financing for non-renewable energies expanded significantly, but has come down to about 15% and is now being very much phased out. But you still see indirect financing of fossil fuels going on. So there's a study in 2022 about this. They're also financing a lot of intensive agriculture that could be leading to deforestation. And there's been some research showing the value at risk, that they're putting nature at risk of about 800 billion a year. But I would say this wasn't good, but actually everyone is doing really badly at the moment. And I didn't want to pick on the EU, but they just make their data more available. So even the EU is providing 80% of the subsidies they're providing is supporting very emissions intensive animal products. So that was a study in Nature Food. So this is agricultural subsidies under the Common Agricultural Policy. They're also providing fossil fuel subsidies of about 56 billion a year, and that increased to 123 billion in 2022 as a result of the energy price spike. So everyone is still doing really, really badly in these areas. Okay, so I'm going to now come on to the systemic risk part. Any questions on any of that before I go forward? Reflections.
The difference between the first period of Bretton Woods and then the massive globalization and privatization that happened in the 80s and subsequently 90s. Because sometimes I think Bretton Woods is only talked about as the first 2 years, but as you, I think, rightly said, the institutions are still happening. But like, would you say there is a difference between the first, let's say, 20 years, give or take, before the massive financialization also of the system happened? And if like going at least to the Bretton Woods of the first 20 years would have been beneficial, or would be beneficial still?
Yeah, so a lot of things happened over time. So when the World Bank was first set up, it was just one institution. Now actually the World Bank is 5 different institutions under one umbrella called the World Bank. And they have different governance, but they're sort of shared board across them. And you mentioned the role of the private sector. So one of the institutions that they set up, I think in the 60s or 70s, was the International Finance Corporation. And that was the part of the World Bank that was set up to support the private sector, because so World Bank lending, as in World Bank as in IBRD, is all to governments. So IBRD lends to all governments. IDA is the bit that lends to the poorest governments, and that provides even cheaper finance to the poorest governments. And then the IFC was set up to support the private sector. And there's also MEGA, which provides guarantees to the financial sector. So there was over time, it was initially envisaged that the World Bank would provide a lot of guarantees to the private sector, but it wasn't until later that it really started to do that. And one of the ways that the World Bank, there's different ways it leverages private finance, and it's actually very effective overall at leveraging private finance. But so it either does it directly through the IFC, where it will lend alongside the private sector and basically takes some of the risk off the private sector, but it also issues bonds to the private market. So it mobilizes a lot of money by issuing bonds, which is, personally, I think is a very positive way to do that, because the World Bank has so many safeguards on it. You know, it is really the ultimate impact investor. And so if it's issuing bonds that are then paid by the private sector, it's really helping the private sector to be impact positive in some ways. Any other questions? Okay, so now we'll get on to the bit which is very much our area of research in our team in ECI. How are we doing for time? So you all know the science, so I'm not going to talk about all of the science of why this is important. I'll talk about the finance side. So a couple of years ago now, maybe 3 years ago, there started to be a lot of focus on how dependent banks and other financial institutions are on nature. So this sort of followed on from all the climate discussions. There was this growing focus on nature. And for example, some analysis by the ECB showing that 75% of bank loans to companies across Europe are dependent on nature. Now, what does dependent on nature actually mean? It's a very, very broad thing. And then what we do is research on what does that actually mean and how do we actually measure that? Yeah, I might skip over a lot of this, but it was really increasingly recognized. And I have another statement that I love here by Frank Elderson, who's the ECB's executive board member, that, you know, we are totally eroding the natural capital on which our entire society is built. And he made a statement which is very, very powerful for a central banker, saying this is not some kind of flower power tree hugging exercise, this is core economics, which I think we would all agree with, but to hear that from a very, very senior central banker was a really positive thing. So we've done a lot of work looking at, okay, what is the nature of nature-related risks, and how do they sort of flow through the economy? How do we estimate them? And one of the reasons we do that is because if we can show that this is a risk, the size of the risk to a particular company or financial institution, then under existing regulation, they have to disclose it and manage it. So that's really important. If we can show that it is what they call under regulation financially material, we have an immediate lever in without having to change anything, that suddenly they have to do something about it. So a lot of our research is trying to show, is it material? Where is it material? And how can you manage that to fit in with this existing regulatory frameworks? So we've done a lot of work, and we worked a lot with the NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System, around how we could show this, the different types of risks. So you basically get physical risks, which are things like deforestation and how that can affect on water, how it can affect on genetic resources, etc. You also get what we call transition risks, which can be, you know, if a government suddenly implements biodiversity policies or strategies, that then means that businesses face an additional cost of acting. So we try and estimate all of these risks. We did one of the first study globally, which we called the Green Scorpion, which looked at trying to value that. So we looked at across the world at key ecosystem services. So remember, we're valuing ecosystem services here, not necessarily biodiversity, which is important, and tried to show how those ecosystem services are changing and how it would impact on financial institutions. And we did a lot of scenario analysis around this and a lot of macroeconomic modeling, and showed that across every country in the world, the potential risks are massive. So I've just picked out actually Mexico here for one of our scenarios, which is our international scenario. So this is looking at how environmental damage around the world affects commodity supply chains. And we show that that can lead to a shock to GDP, which for Mexico is sort of 8% and then increasing up to about 12% within the next couple of decades. So this is massive. This is bigger than climate change. This is a massive risk that we're not taking account of at the moment. And we then did that for the UK. So we did a big study with the Treasury in the UK, the Green Finance Institute, with the financial regulator, the FCA, looking at what's the value of this risk just from a UK perspective. And remember, we're taking this very narrow view on risk. We're looking at economic and financial risk in a very conservatively defined way. And here we showed that, you know, even for the UK, which is a country you'd think was pretty resilient to a lot of these risks, we face massive risks. So under 3 scenarios that we looked at, we saw losses to GDP within the next decade could be between 6 and 12%. Now that's bigger than the shock of COVID. It's much bigger than the shock of the global financial crisis. And if you add climate change to it, which is what we've done here, so blue is just nature, and then the orange, we add climate change and look at the GDP impact. And adding climate change on top can almost double that again, because the two things interact with each other. So this is an enormous risk which we're not taking account of, and financial institutions and corporates are not taking account of in their decision making. So we would certainly argue that this is a risk that they have to be acting on. And it's actually, I would argue, so these days, central banks require financial institutions to assess climate-related risks. And the reason they did that was this tragedy of the horizons argument, saying that, look, you're creating a risk that by the time you see that, you won't be able to do anything about it because of the delay. And we argued that actually that's only one of the reasons why this is really important. So for nature, there's also issues, what we called a tragedy of scale, because this is a risk that's happening everywhere across the world, every supply chain, every country at the same time. So if you're a financial institution, if you're HSBC or Barclays, you can't just say, well, I'm going to diversify out of that. I'll just move. You can't diversify out of this risk. It's everywhere. So it requires a regulatory response. That's very, very clear. And, you know, there's been a lot of work on this area, and there was a great piece by a group of lawyers that looked at this and showed, based on the evidence we created, but also others, that, you know, that in their opinion, directors are required under law to consider this now. The evidence is strong enough that directors of companies should be looking at this now under current regulation. So that's the sort of the whole financial system. But what does that then mean back for these Bretton Woods institutions? So I think we also need to recognize that, you know, within the development mandate of the development banks and the IMF, that nature is really core to that as well. And here I've actually drawn, I'm not going to say much about this because Oxford does some amazing research on this topic, and I couldn't do it justice, of which many of the authors are here now. But I want to point out a few that colleagues have done. This isn't something that I've worked on myself, but, you know, for example, great work by my colleague Jim Hall, looking at nature-based infrastructure, showing that if you look at sort of building nature into your infrastructure projects, you get these huge additional development benefits of that. A great paper out by Nat Seddon's team and others on the benefits of including nature within fiscal planning in countries, and all of the evidence that, you know, if countries themselves invest in nature, it delivers these huge benefits. Nature-based Food Initiative, Knowledge Hub. So there's huge evidence that nature and development are totally aligned. And further, that if we don't, in our development work, in the way we're thinking about this, include nature, again, we're shooting ourselves and developing countries in the foot. So this is really critical. So what's the manifesto then? So I've got 6 parts to my manifesto. So I see that, you know, there's a lot of things that have to happen across the whole financial system to solve this. And a lot of our research in the team is about private financial institutions and what needs to happen there. And I already mentioned what needs to happen in central banks. So central banks need to be building this into the way that they're regulating financial institutions. There's very clear evidence for that. So there's a lot that needs to happen in that area. But what do we need these development finance institutions to do? So I think the first thing just to recognize is that actually the IFIs, if you look at their role in the broader economy, they're actually broader finance system, they're actually quite small. So, you know, even in 1944, they played a fairly small role. And now, you know, the financial system is, you know, up to around 200 trillion in assets globally. Whereas, you know, the World Bank's lending is in the 1 trillion. So, you know, they're still sizable, but they have a sort of a small firepower that they can use. So they have to use it very strategically to look at how can we direct flows to support countries. However, for the low income countries and lower middle income countries, they do still play a very important role in financing governments. So they're quite a large percentage of the finance. And they also play a really important role in providing technical assistance to governments. And as I said, the World Bank itself is very unique in that it provides very long-term loans. So a lot of private finance, you know, even say private financing of sovereign bonds is maybe like 10 to 15 years, where the World Bank will be lending 25, 30 years. So that's really important. So I should recognize that they're already doing a lot on this agenda as well. So it's really seen, and it was back in 1996 on the IMF side, that nature is a core part of their mandate. So they even the IMF, which is an incredibly conservative institution, recognized as early as 1996 that if they were going to fulfill their mandate of macroeconomic stability, they couldn't do that if they didn't think about the environment and environmental degradation. They recognized that back then. And the World Bank also, and the other development banks have released you know, various statements and methodologies as well, including the common principles for how they track their nature positive finance. So there's a lot happening, and this shows globally around the world levels of biodiversity development finance. And you can see that actually the multilaterals are playing a really big role. So probably about half of it is coming from multilaterals now. So half of the nature finance that's flowing to developing countries. But what do we want to see then? The manifesto. So there's only 6 of them, 6 bits of this manifesto. So number 1, they have to integrate nature within their diagnostic, surveillance, and advice. Now this sounds very techie, but the World Bank and the IMF provide key diagnostics that have a huge influence on how governments make decisions. So the classic one would be debt sustainability analyses, which is obviously a lot in the media at the moment, given all the debt issues. So the IMF in particular provides debt sustainability analyses for all countries, including the UK, which is why the UK gets very nervous when we issue a budget and we wait for what the IMF is going to say. They liked the recent one, apparently. But that analysis does not include nature. So the way that analysis is set up is that it accounts for revenues that the government is getting from taxation in particular. So if you're a country that has lots of resources that can be exploited to create tax revenue, fossil fuels, things like that, that analysis is going to direct you to burn, because it doesn't take into account all of these other benefits that you're getting from those resources being in the ground and the nature resources. So it distorts everything. It sounds techie, but it has a huge distortionary effect from one analytical tool. And that's only one of several analytical tools. So there's also what they call it the FSAP, which is the financial sector version of that, which is beginning to integrate nature, but extremely early. There are things like various diagnostics that they do. The IMF's macroeconomic diagnostics. So no country can receive lending from the World Bank unless they get a tick from the IMF in terms of their macroeconomic stability. And those analyses don't include the natural assets. So again, everything is pushing the system towards things that would destroy nature and create revenue now. Number 2 is its role as a norm setter and a knowledge bank. So the World Bank in particular does a lot on safeguards. So safeguards of projects. And that, you know, there's a lot of, well, not a lot, some research that looks at whether these are working or not. And it's sort of quite mixed. But the important thing about them is they act as a norm setter for other institutions. So the private sector, for example, copies what the IFC does. So getting them right is really important because everyone else copies what they do. They're really important at playing training and capacity building and also tools. So they provide a lot of data, but there's no biodiversity nature data provided now. So if you look on the sort of their open data platforms, there's nothing related to nature on there at all. Number 3, and again, another thing that sounds techie, aligning fiscal policy with nature-related goals. So we did a big analysis after COVID, looking at whether COVID expenditure was aligned with climate goals. And we recently reran it for nature goals, and we haven't published it yet, but it doesn't look good. It's, you know, less than 1% of the finance flows are aligned with nature, and around 50% could be making things worse. So this is really important. And there's certain, again, the IFIs have a really big impact on how, or can have a big impact on how governments allocate financing through the incentives that they can provide. They can influence things like subsidies, public expenditure, taxation policy, environmental regulation through the toolkit that they have available. So it's really important that again, that toolkit pushes people in the right direction. Number 4, so this is more the sort of tradition we do a lot of research on in our team. How do we get the private sector to do the right things? So again, the development banks in developing countries can play a really important role in steering private finance to be not damaging to nature and helping nature instead. And then I won't go through the long list, but there's a huge amount of things that they can do. You know, everything from helping them issue bonds that support nature recovery, making sure that our what we call development finance institutes think about nature. So it's quite shocking if you look across. So in the world, imagine that there's this sort of architecture of financial institutions that are all channeling money in different directions to try to help development. I can't find any that think about nature. So we have this whole infrastructure at the moment that isn't doing anything that could be leveraged to actually deliver nature finance. So that there's a lot that they can do in this area. The next piece, and this piece is maybe a little bit controversial. So what I've called scaling up and strategic allocation of concessional finance, which sounds very techie, but basically the World Bank in particular has increasingly played a role in financing global public goods. So for those of you that are economists, environmental economists will know that in general, people don't finance global public goods because other people benefit from them. So you have to give governments will give incentives to get the private sector or others to finance these global public goods. And nature is, I would say, our biggest global public good. So I think there's a really clear rationale for the World Bank to be providing these incentives for both the private sector and the public sector to do much more to finance global public goods. And they do have what they call a global public good window, which is very new, but this needs to be scaled up massively. Now, I think where the controversy comes in, though, is that what is a global public good is not, could end up missing things that are really important for one country in terms of their nature restoration. So I think we need to think really carefully about how we would allocate this to make sure that we don't just allocate things that are good globally, like the Amazon rainforest, and forget things that are really important locally. So we need different mechanisms to support both. And then the final one, and I would say that all of the ones I've shown are smaller tweaks to what we already have. This one I think is incredibly important and is a bigger tweak. So this is what I've called the Earth Stability Board or the Nature Stability Board, and systemically important natural systems, the SINs. So in finance, we have something called the Financial Stability Board, which is an independent entity, which basically is there to watch all of the risks that the financial system is making to itself and to survey that. And if they see risks building up somewhere, like so this was particularly accelerated after the global financial crisis, to say, look, there's a risk you need to do something about it. We need to tighten regulations, and they supervise and monitor this. But we don't have that for nature or climate change, actually. I would argue that we need an entity like that is watching and monitoring and saying, look, there's risk allocate growing here, or these particular drivers are creating risk, and you need to do something about it. And I see this as being quite analogous to the Financial Stability Board. I think we also need this because on nature, we just have so many international institutions that have to work together that you need some coordinating body. I think it has to be independent, but influential. It needs the same way that FSB does, where it has levers that it can pull. But one of the things, and again, this is where it might be controversial, that I think they need to identify a list of systemically important natural systems and be monitoring those really carefully. And I think then they need to be working with their members, who would be the entities that can actually do something about this, to monitor and manage those risks and be setting rules and allocating finance to deal with these growing risks. And the other sort of more potentially controversial one is I think they need to identify systemically important banks. So there is already a concept of a systemically important bank. Has anyone heard of a systemically important bank? So these are banks that can crash the system. So this was a concept that came out after the global financial crisis, where we have, I think it's about 22 banks globally that could crash the economy. And so they get extra regulation on them linked to the FSB and the IMF, and extra what we call capital weights. So they have to basically pay an extra fee to deal with these risks. And I think we need the same for nature. So we need to work out, particularly for these systemically important banks, where are they creating risk through their lending, and be incentivizing them in some way to be managing those, either for additional capital weights, risk weights, or maybe levies. And I think actually we probably need to do the same for big systemically important corporates as well. Those 250 companies that I mentioned that are creating 73% of the problem, those are the systemically important companies. So should they then be paying some levy into a fund based on the risk that they're creating to the rest of the world? So those would be my 6 manifesto areas. So just to summarize it, so I've taken quite a different perspective on nature. I focus on that real risk lens, because that lens means something within financial regulation. Is a lever that we can pull if we can show risk to make financial institutions do something. So I've argued that nature, climate development, and poverty alleviation are aligned. Natural capital is such an important part of growth and development in poor countries, growth of well-being, growth of not just economic growth. They're essential for macroeconomic stability and security. So our research has shown that. And our current models of the economy and finance are undermining this, because we have all these distortions that I've mentioned. So I've argued as well that if we want to achieve our goals, we have to better leverage this toolkit that we have of these international institutions, and not just tell them to put more money out the door, which is what we tell them at the moment, but tell them to use their other levers to start steering the wider economy towards things that are nature positive and risk reducing. And then I laid out the manifesto, which actually is missing the bottom one, which is this Earth Stability Board. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Fascinating. Really nice 101 as well. Thank you, Bas. Before we open up, so one question I would have is, if you have this manifesto, what's the entry points to get this change to happen? How persuasive would this be with the IFIs? What's necessary to make this change happen?
And you're asking me to give away all my tricks now. Well, I think first and foremost, the shareholders have to buy into it. So the IMF and the World Bank have shareholders, which is basically us. So we are all shareholders, but we are represented by our governments on the board. So we have a director and executive director that sits on the board. So we have to convince them first and foremost, and we have to convince the World Bank itself. But if you can convince the shareholders, that's the most important thing. We also have to convince what they call the clients. So the countries that actually receive this financing, that this is in their interest. And this is why I included that very brief slide on why this is important for their development, that this happens, because the clients rule in some ways in these institutions, or they increasingly do. So they have to see it as being there. So we have to convince the clients as well. And I think there's all sorts of issues that we need to overcome that are more narrative. So all of those caveats that I had laid out at the beginning to get people on board with this type of approach. So recognizing this is part of the solution. This isn't the whole solution to the problem, but I would see it as a necessary but not sufficient part. Like, if we don't get this stuff right, we can't achieve our nature and biodiversity goals. So we need to be making that argument globally. We need to be convincing the people that can pull the levers. But I first go to the shareholders.
Okay, we can open up the questions now.
Thank you very much for this super insightful talk. I found it really fascinating because this is an area that's completely alien to me. And to follow on from Advinder's question, if, for instance, you want to get the public on board with, say, biodiversity projects, you can get them to do citizen science, or you can motivate them in one way or another. So because I think your manifesto is really meaningful and worthwhile, but is there something that someone who's not a specialist in the area can actually do to exert pressure on the clients that you have just mentioned? And what is it that can be done?
Yeah, so I do think citizens have to persuade their governments as well. So, the biggest challenge, so a lot of this techie stuff we can make techie arguments for, but this, what I went over very quickly, I think is the biggest point, because there's, making that argument that protecting nature now is good for your development when you're an incredibly poor country and you just need jobs and growth, and it's much easier just to extract your fossil fuels and sell them. But to make the argument that actually there is a different vision of growth that doesn't need that is quite hard, and lots of politics around that, lots of power issues. So I think, but the public, civil society really need to understand this as well. And to give a shout out to my colleagues who do wonderful work in this area, I think it's exactly that sort of work in developing countries to provide the evidence, I think is really important, because we can't just tell developing countries, you need to protect your nature to protect us as a world. That's not a fair argument. So it has to be in their interests as well.
Thank you very much, Nicola. So I work still in the multilateral development banks, still day-to-day basis, help them process the due diligence on most transactions. So I think there's a huge amount of pressure for these IFIs to actually do development differently. In terms of entry points, I think some of the high-level international initiatives like the ISSB, this sustainable, the reporting boards, they have these new standards set up to disclose and to assess risks, nature and the climate risks. I think these are very effective instruments, actually. So what these IFIs are now trying to report on the portfolio. And also, just operationally speaking, all these banks now, they have to check the investment. Are they aligned with the Paris Agreement goals? Are they aligned with nature positive objective? And how do we do that? That's where I think institutions like the university here can make a really important contribution in terms of setting those technical standards. And right now it's very ad hoc. They are doing the best, but there's no a robust system in place, and everybody now recognize it is important. We have to do something, but how do we do it? How do we do it systematically? It's still very early stage, and that's where I think we need a lot of inputs from universities and people like yourselves.
Yeah, I think I totally agree, and I think that so the World Bank has been on, and all of the multilateral development banks have been on that journey, the journey on climate for what, 10 years now, shall we say? But on nature is only about 2 years in terms of the tracking and alignment methodologies, although safeguards have been around for decades. So it is, but I totally agree with you that could be really important.
Thanks, Nicola. That was so clear and really compelling. And I really appreciate that you're very clearly working with the design that is. So in that spirit, on your last point about the Earth Stability Board or the Nature Stability Board,
Yeah.
and you said what it needs is an independent monitoring body, following key natural systems. So of course, that information already exists in the world, right? There are institutions, people who are doing an incredible job of that monitoring. So that exists. We're at least 2 steps away from what's needed here. One is that being mandated and recognized, like the planetary boundaries team, just accepting whether or not people say planetary boundaries is, I'm looking at Advinda. Let's for a moment say the planetary boundaries framework does enough and. They're now doing annual assessments of planetary boundary. You could say off the shelf, that's it. There's the monitoring we need. What if those governments mandated that? And then that would be the information going into your Nature Stability Board. But then there's an extra step that I'm curious about, which is what would be the rule where that would actually have traction and override the very dominant interests of capital? And I don't know how that works in the Financial Stability Board. I mean, what would be the design at which point that monitoring raised its flag, as the Earth System Science are doing every day, saying this system and these current flows are destroying the living world at an unfeasible rate. We have to change it. What would be the design that would work with these institutions that would actually override capital's interest?
I totally agree with the question, and so maybe I'll answer it to you. So one is the way the Financial Stability Board sort of does it, and it does a similar thing. So if it sees one big bank accumulating too much risk, it itself can't do anything, but there's enough agreement amongst the members who can do something and see it in their sort of systemic interest to do so, that they will pull the lever in regulation and manage that, so that it works in that case, and that has a big impact on those banks. So those 20 odd banks, systemically important banks, for example, they have an extra charge put on them that no other banks does. So it's actually a distortion in its own right. So it does have a big impact on them. And the fact that they have to disclose this, they have to disclose to the world that they're creating this impact as well. So they all want to be as low down the ranking as they can. But still, it's not a very powerful lead, but I think it works because we've had so many financial crises and government central banks around the world, that IMF realize that it's in all of our interest. But are we there on nature yet that the same would happen, particularly when you're working against these big corporates and, as you say, the fundamental economic system that we have? But I think that so first and foremost, I think if we can make something like the planetary boundaries mandated as a system, I think that's a really good start. If we can have, say, all of the UN agencies as members that will be agreeing, as well as the IMF and the World Bank, that that's the monitoring system, and if it goes wrong, you, FAO, or whomever, you, World Bank, it's your job to deal with this. I think that's another additional step, like ownership and responsibility of risk, which we can talk about. But I think that the key thing would be this, linking it to the systemically important banks and systemically important corporates, and having agreement that you're putting some levy on them. I don't think it necessarily needs to be that big, actually. I think so on the SIBs, as we call them at the moment, it's only about 1% levy, but it still creates this incentive that they don't want to be on the list as much as possible. So it's not a total answer, but I think if we can create the system and ramp it up, But the key thing is that we need this much stronger global recognition that this is systemically important for everyone, and it's in everyone's interest to manage this. And I think one of the advantages of this agenda over climate change, which I often get in trouble for saying, is this is immediate. Like, the part of the problem of climate change is that we do the bad stuff now and you don't feel the impact for 20, 30 years. Whereas that's not true on nature. Like, the risk accumulates over time, but it has a very immediate impact. So I think, and people will feel that globally. Yeah. So it doesn't answer the question, but hopefully we can all work together to solve it.
Thanks very much. Wonderful as ever, Nicola. Thank you for your insights. I've just following on from Kate's question, which was actually, I think, the right question and the one I was going to start asking. I think there are three things. To get shareholder buy-in, which, as you say, you sort of need political buy-in. And to get that, you need the punters around the world to recognize that this is a good idea. And so I think we're back at a usual blocker for a lot of these sensitive interventions, which is that the forces of natural destruction have armies of tens of thousands of PR consultants shaping the agendas around the propagation of the status quo. And we don't, those who care about the environment. So I think there's a big task here for mass public education in order to get what looks like an elite intervention to work. The thing I love about elite interventions as they are is that they don't require mass education, but I think this one sort of does. I had a question about whether the analogy with systemically important banks is, I mean, I love it, the idea of systemically important companies as well, but whether it quite maps over. The thing about preventing financial crisis is that you don't want too much market concentration. And that's why having a list and a fee helps you to deliver the outcome you want, because nobody wants to be too big to fail. In the nature case, you could have every company, every bank not wanting to be too big to fail, but still the cumulative actions of the system destroying nature. And so I think that difference is unfortunate, because otherwise I'm kind of, this is brilliant and we're done here. But I'm just wondering is that a real difference? Have I got that right? And if so, is it very problematic?
Yeah, so on the shareholder point, I think in some way influencing the shareholders of the bank, I think, and the IMF is slightly simpler than influencing government, because they tend to be in very technocratic institutions in government as well. And I'm sure they are exposed to lobbying over financing fossil fuels and things, but they seem to have been less exposed than governments. And so, for example, our UK ED to the bank sits in Treasury, the UK ED to IMF is in Treasury and the bank is in FCDO. So quite technocratic institutions, actually, and that tends to be similar. And the big, obviously, discussion at the World Bank at the moment, and the whole reform agenda, is we need more money in general. And the main constraints to that have just been fiscal constraints on developed countries. All countries at the moment are sort of suffering, apart from the US, that have been doing particularly well until now. But that's been a real problem, and there's been a lot of setbacks to getting the bank to do more and rethink it. So that's the sort of level of discussion. I think these sorts of tweaks, I think, are not as big as that. So I think it wouldn't be subjected to that. I think what I would say is the big hole in this is one is that. So I said 73% of the risk is coming from big corporates, but actually, I've missed everything that's happening on the ground. Farmers that are just trying to make a living, and all of that. This is so much more complicated than the actions of just 250 big corporates. And also, a lot of those 250 big corporates aren't actually receive very little financing from the global financial system. A lot of them are self-financed. So there was a good paper by UCL recently that looked at, like, for those big corporates, how much of it were they, if you could actually green finance, would it make a difference? And they concluded probably not actually, because they tend to be private institutions and not listed, not subject to the same regulations. So we need, so this systemically important corporates, we need to think about how we regulate these corporates that don't necessarily fit under our current regulations properly. So there's some big questions there. And your GSIBs question, yeah, another good question. I think one thing I point to say was that there was recently a really good paper which I was on the advisory board for by WWF that analysed the nature commitments of the existing GSIBs. Just came out just before COP16, and they showed both the impact that these systemically important banks are having through their financing, particularly in areas like deforestation, but also that they're not doing much about it at the moment. So if you look at their policies, they barely even mention nature. So again, it's not a whole part of the solution, but I think that actually it could be. And they also kind of act as norm setters. So the types of banks on the list are things like HSBC, and I think Standard Chartered is on there as well. There's a lot of big Chinese banks on there. So it's not the whole solution, but I think could be. There's also, there's a whole hierarchy of other banks that sit underneath it. So there's nationally systemically important banks as well. So I think they could, there's ways that you could go out further from them.
I'll take a couple from online. We had a plethora of questions online. I'll just take a couple of them. One is wondering about currency. What if we didn't have a gold standard, but instead a nature standard? That is to say, monetized profits would depend on how nature positive the corporate or the investment is, rather than a consumption-based monetized profit.
So I'm wondering if that question comes from Michael Obersteiner, because that's what he says. Well, so that's what he said in response. It's like, we need to replace the gold standard with a nature standard. And his argument there being, so gold obviously is a form of natural capital in its own right, a slightly different type of natural capital. And that actually maybe the most stable currency is nature. And so why don't we use that as a way? That's definitely on the radical end. And I'm not a monetary economist, so we'll have to ask a monetary economist.
Okay, I'll take one more from online as well. Bretton Woods is also about taming capital flows between countries. Without going back to full capital controls, should IFIs think about better controlling international financial flows, usually from developed country banks to emerging economies that destroy nature?
And so the bank and the IMF can't control that directly, but they do it through the supervision and the regulation. So I think the types of measures that I mentioned under that will have an influence on that. I think the other thing that the bank can do, well, not the bank, but in agreement with central banks around the world. So certainly at the moment, you don't get enough financial flows between the global north and the global south for various structural reasons around currency risks and our regulatory frameworks. And you also get financial flows that are damaging. So those two things, the World Bank and the IMF can influence, both through working with other central banks around the world. So there has been a lot of work in both areas. So for example, I was on a European Commission high-level expert group that was looking at how we can change regulation in the EU to allow more finance to flow. And what tends to happen in things like the fora that discuss these issues, like the G20 Sustainable Finance Fora, is that often the World Bank and the IMF are there and with the developed countries and kind of representing the interests of developing countries. So I think that role could be expanded too.
Okay, we'll take just one or two more from the audience, I think, and then we'll finish.
Thank you. Just thinking about what you were saying about the Financial Stability Board, and wondering if there's a role also of the different financial regulators in different countries and different jurisdictions, because they may have more the option to put more pressure on the financial institutions because they have the ability to take away banking licenses. So is that something that you've kind of come across, you've thought about with this idea?
Yes, so actually a lot of our research is on the role of domestic regulators. So yes, domestic regulators can play a much more direct role. The reason that the FSB is relevant is that FSB sort of acts as it's a coordination mechanism. So if you look at who are the members of the FSB, it tends to be the central banks from around the world. So it's a coordination mechanism and to make sure that regulation is harmonized across countries and risk is being managed across countries appropriately. But yeah, I totally, the actual implementation will have to be by the domestic regulators.
Thank you. I guess a question I had was, I guess in recent years, we've seen that the monopoly that these institutions used to enjoy has been weakened to an extent, especially Chinese players have come in, have offered loans with less conditionality to a lot of economies that have been, I guess, probably a bit tired of the many strings we've tended to attach to this kind of lending. How do you ensure or avoid that this leads to further fragmentation? Because when I see this, I think that some of the clients might look at this and think that this is additional strings attached that would drive, them towards, I don't want to say the competition, but at least other lending that's available.
Yeah, so that argument affects one of the six. So only one of them, because only one of the six was actually about what they're lending, their core lending to governments. And as I mentioned, that at the moment, they're having a declining role because of actors like China, but in the low-income countries, they still tend to be quite dominant there. But you're right. So, if they start putting big conditions on all of these areas, that will deter them from taking finance from the development banks and perhaps moving them to the private sector. But for the poorest countries, at least, the World Bank will still be probably providing much more cheap finance than, say, the Chinese government, but we'd have to get the data to look at that. But I'd be very surprised because basically the World Bank lends at almost zero interest rate effectively. So it's very, very, very low interest rate.
Okay, great. I think we'll wrap up there. We have drinks around the corner, so if anybody wants to come have an informal conversation, just coming over and have a drink, Nicola or lunch yourselves. And thank you once again for absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for the question.